North Dakota Plains, winter, 1889. From the road cutting through the township, the Hendrickson farm looked ordinary enough. A weathered farmhouse with smoke curling from the chimney, a small barn, a chicken coop listing slightly to the left, the kind of homestead you'd pass without wondering what went on inside. But beneath that property, beneath the frozen ground where nothing should grow and nothing should thrive, something unusual was taking shape. A woman was moving her kitchen underground. Not her root cellar, not a storage pit. Her entire cooking and preservation operation. And when the worst cold snap in North Dakota's recorded history froze the territory solid for 3 straight weeks, that strange decision, the one her neighbors had quietly mocked, became the reason her family ate preserved tomatoes and fresh potatoes all winter, while her neighbor's food froze into ruined blocks of ice. If you want to see one practical food preservation method every week that actually worked when supplies meant survival, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's dive into a piece of frontier food engineering that changed how people thought about winter storage. Ingrid Hendrickson wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was a 38-year-old widow with 3 children, a daughter of 14 and twin boys of 11, working a homestead claim 5 miles outside what would eventually become the town of Cooperstown. Her husband had died 14 months earlier from pneumonia, the same respiratory illness that seemed to hunt through every drafty farmhouse in the territory when temperatures dropped below 0. That previous winter had nearly taken her food supply, too. The farmhouse was standard for the region, rough-hewn log walls chinked with clay and straw, a 2-room layout with a sleeping loft and a cast-iron stove that burned wood faster than Ingrid could split it. The kitchen occupied the main room, separated from the small parlor by nothing more than a change in floorboards. And on cold mornings, the kind of mornings that came 5 months out of the year in North Dakota, everything froze. Ice would form on the inside of the window glass by dawn. The water bucket near the door would freeze solid overnight, even covered with a wooden lid. Milk left on the counter turned to ice within hours. The children would wake to see their breath in the air, visible clouds that hung in the kitchen despite the fire burning through the night. Ingrid would rise before first light to stoke the stove, coaxing heat into the frigid space, watching frost patterns retreat slowly from the walls. But the cold inside was manageable. Uncomfortable, exhausting, but manageable. What destroyed families was what the cold did to their food. The previous winter, the winter of 1888, had been brutal. Temperatures dropped to 30 below 0 and stayed there for weeks. The small pantry off the kitchen, the space where Ingrid stored her preserved food, became an icebox. She'd spent the entire summer of 1887 putting up preserves, 60 jars of tomatoes from the garden, 40 jars of beans, 20 jars of applesauce, pickled beets, cucumber relish, corn relish, everything she'd managed to grow and preserve before the first frost. By December, half of it was ruined. She stood in the kitchen that March morning, opening jar after jar of preserves she'd put up the previous summer. Tomatoes frozen solid, glass cracked. The red fruit had expanded as it froze, shattering the containers from the inside. Beans, same. Frozen into solid blocks, jars burst open, contents spilled and ruined. Applesauce, burst containers. The sweet pulp turned to ice and then to mush as temperatures fluctuated between deep freeze at night and barely above freezing during the day. 60 jars, an entire summer's work, gone. The potatoes were worse. She'd stored 200 pounds of potatoes in wooden bins in the pantry, covered with burlap, thinking that would be enough protection. By February, they'd frozen solid. When temperatures warmed slightly, they thawed into a black, rotten, inedible mass. The smell was nauseating. She hauled bucket after bucket of ruined potatoes out to the hog pen, watching months of careful harvest turn to pig feed. The smoked meat fared only slightly better. The strips of pork and venison hung in the pantry stayed preserved by the cold, But the temperature swings caused moisture problems. Ice would form on the meat, then melt, then freeze again. By March, half the meat showed signs of spoilage, discoloration, a slippery texture that meant it was no longer safe. Her daughter Helga, then 13, had looked at the dwindling supplies with growing worry. The twin boys, too young to fully understand, asked why they were eating so much bread and dried beans. Ingrid didn't tell them it was because everything else was gone. She didn't tell them that they had 4 more weeks until the ground thawed enough to plant anything, and their food supply was stretched thinner than a worn bedsheet. They survived. Barely. The church provided some charity. A neighbor shared smoked fish. They rationed everything down to the last scrap. But Ingrid decided that winter, standing in a kitchen full of shattered jars and spoiled food, that something had to change. She started paying attention to the root cellar. The root cellar was a separate structure, dug into the hillside 30 feet from the farmhouse. Her husband had built it their second year on the claim, excavating 8 feet down into the earth, lining the walls with fieldstone, creating a storage space for vegetables that needed to stay cool but not frozen. The root cellar stayed noticeably warmer than the farmhouse kitchen. She noticed it that previous winter when retrieving the few potatoes that had survived in the deeper bins. Inside the cellar, on a night when the farmhouse was below freezing, the air felt almost mild. Not warm, not comfortable, but stable. She stood there one evening in late March, checking on the last of the winter storage, feeling the relative warmth, and thought about the difference. The farmhouse kitchen fluctuated wildly. 20 degrees when the stove died overnight, maybe 40 degrees when the fire burned hot. But the temperature swung constantly, chasing the fire, fighting the wind, never stable. The root cellar held steady. She'd put a thermometer down there out of curiosity. 45 degrees in December, 48 degrees in January, 46 degrees in February. Never freezing, never warm, just constant. She stood there in the dim light from her oil lamp, listening to the silence of the earth around her, feeling the stillness, and thought, what if I could cook here? Not just store, cook. Preserve food here, where the temperature never swings, where jars won't freeze and crack, where potatoes won't turn to ice. It wasn't a brilliant plan, it was a desperate one. But desperation makes you practical, and Ingrid had spent one winter watching her children go hungry while food rotted around her. That was enough. Her husband had thought she was being foolish when she first mentioned the idea of moving operations underground. People will think you've lost your mind, he'd said, not unkindly, just practical in his way. She'd let the idea drop then, focused on other things, tried to make the farmhouse kitchen work better. He died that winter, pneumonia, before the worst of the food loss happened, before he could see whether she was right or wrong. Sometimes she stood in the root cellar and wondered if he'd have been proud or embarrassed. She decided it didn't matter. He was gone, she was here, and the children needed to eat. She began excavating in early April, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig. Working in the mornings after feeding the livestock and before the children needed her for lessons. The plan was simple. The root cellar was already 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 12 feet long. Good for storage, but too small for cooking. She'd expand it northward, adding another 10 feet of length, creating a space large enough for a cooking stove, a work table, proper shelving for preserved goods. The excavation was back-breaking work. 1,120 cubic feet of earth, hauled one wheelbarrow load at a time. She dug with a spade and a pickaxe, loosening the clay soil, filling the wheelbarrow, pushing it up the sloped entrance, dumping it in low spots around the property. 6 weeks of work. No help. No announcement to neighbors, just quiet, methodical digging. She worked alone. Her daughter was too small for the heavy lifting, and the boys too young to dig safely at that depth. No neighbors offered help, and she didn't ask. This was her idea, her strange plan, and she'd see it through by herself. Some mornings her back ached so badly she could barely straighten. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again in new places. But the chamber took shape slowly, carefully. The excavation itself was only the beginning. For the walls, she used what was available: fieldstone from the creek bed that ran through the property, flat pieces of limestone and granite that she could stack without mortar. She'd watched her husband build the original root cellar, understood the basics: dry stack the stones, lean them slightly inward, let gravity hold them in place. Behind the stones, pack earth tight, creating a barrier between the chamber and the surrounding soil. The walls went up slowly, stone by stone. Each piece had to fit properly, had to support the weight above it, had to create a stable structure. She built the walls 18 inches thick, not just for strength, but for thermal mass. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. An 18-inch wall would hold temperature steady for hours after a fire died down. The floor was packed earth, tamped hard with a wooden post, sloped slightly toward one corner where she dug a small sump, a hole filled with gravel to catch any groundwater that might seep in. North Dakota clay soil holds water, and underground spaces can flood if drainage isn't planned properly. She'd learned that from watching neighbors' root cellars fail. Timber framing came next. She salvaged lumber from the old chicken coop that had collapsed the previous winter, cutting and fitting the beams to support the ceiling. The beams ran perpendicular to the existing root cellar joists, creating a ceiling for the expanded chamber that could bear the weight of earth above and human traffic on the surface. She notched the beams into the stone walls, wedging them tight, testing each one by hanging from it with her full weight. The entrance required modification. The original root cellar had a steep, narrow stairway, barely wide enough for one person. She widened it to 3 feet, rebuilt the steps at a gentler angle, created a passage she could carry supplies through without scraping her shoulders. 12 steps, 45-degree angle, each step made from a split log laid on its flat side. At the top and bottom of the stairs, she installed doors. The top door was heavy oak, salvaged from a barn door, hung on iron hinges she'd traded eggs for at the general store. The bottom door was lighter, pine planks fitted together but substantial enough to hold heat in. The double door system created an airlock effect. Cold air from outside wouldn't pour directly into the kitchen. Heat from below wouldn't escape directly to the surface. Ventilation was critical. Without fresh air, the space would become suffocating. Smoke from cooking would accumulate. Carbon monoxide from the stove would build up, invisible and deadly. She fashioned a ventilation system from clay drainage tiles, 6 inches in diameter, rising from the chamber's ceiling through 8 feet of earth to the surface. The pipe opened 20 feet from the entrance, far enough that wind wouldn't blow directly down it and create backdraft. She capped the surface opening with a simple wooden cover, angled to shed rain but allowing air to flow. Inside the chamber, the ventilation pipe drew naturally. Warm air rises. As the stove heated the space, hot air would climb up the pipe, pulling fresh air in through the entrance. Simple physics. No mechanical parts, just natural convection. The fireplace was the most complex element. She couldn't simply set a stove in the corner and hope for the best. Underground fires require proper venting, or they'll smoke you out in minutes. She built a corner hearth from fieldstone, creating a firebox 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. The back and sides were lined with fire brick, the good, dense brick that wouldn't crack under heat. She'd traded butter and eggs at the general store for those bricks, expensive but necessary. From the firebox, she built a chimney of clay tiles, mortared together with a mix of clay and sand, rising up through the stone wall and then through the earth, emerging 15 feet away from the ventilation pipe. The separation was important. The chimney drew smoke out. The ventilation pipe brought fresh air in. If they opened too close together, wind would push smoke back down the ventilation shaft. She moved her cast iron cooking stove down the stairs in pieces. The top plates lifted off, the firebox separated from the base. Even in pieces, each section was brutally heavy. She rigged a rope system, lowering each part down the stairs with Helga guiding from below, both of them straining to control the descent. They reassembled the stove in the corner, connected it to the stone chimney with a length of stovepipe, packed the joints with clay to seal any gaps. The real heating system wasn't the stove alone, it was the earth itself. 18 inches of stone wall surrounded the chamber. Behind that, 6 feet of clay soil on all sides. Above the chamber, 2 feet of packed earth and sod. All of that mass, thousands of pounds of stone and soil, would slowly absorb heat from the small cooking fires and radiate it back over hours. The Earth's natural temperature at 8 feet deep, even in North Dakota winter, stayed between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The chamber would never freeze, even without a fire, and with a modest fire burning just a few hours a day for cooking, the surrounding mass would warm to 50, maybe 55 degrees, and hold that temperature through the night. She furnished the chamber simply. A work table, rough planks laid across stone supports, shelving built into the walls, alcoves carved into the stone during construction, deep enough to hold rows of canning jars. Wooden bins along the north wall for root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets. Iron hooks driven into the timber ceiling for hanging dried herbs and smoked meats. A water barrel near the entrance, a 30-gallon oak barrel she'd fill from the well and carry down in buckets. No running water underground, but the barrel held enough for several days of cooking and cleaning. 3 oil lamps positioned around the room provided light. The chamber had no windows, no natural light, just the steady glow of lamp flame on stone walls. By early June, the underground kitchen was finished. Not beautiful, not conventional, but functional. She stood in the center of the space one evening, turning slowly, examining what she'd built. Stone walls, earth ceiling, packed floor. A cooking stove in the corner, shelves waiting for jars, bins ready for vegetables. It looked strange. She knew that. A cooking space carved into the earth beneath a North Dakota farm. A kitchen where the ceiling was soil, where light came from lamps, where the temperature held steady regardless of what happened above ground. But it was warm. Even now, in early summer, with no fire burning, the space felt comfortable. She checked the thermometer hanging on the wall, 52 degrees. Outside, the evening temperature was dropping into the 40s. Inside the chamber, separated from the outside air by 8 feet of earth, the temperature barely noticed. People noticed, of course. In a township where farms were spread miles apart but gossip traveled fast, people always noticed when someone did something different. And what Ingrid Hendrickson was doing seemed very different indeed. John Brenneman saw her first. He farmed the claim 2 miles east, a solid man with a reputation for good judgment and practical sense. He rode past the Hendrickson place one afternoon in mid-June and saw Ingrid carrying a basket of kitchen supplies, pots and utensils, toward the root cellar entrance instead of toward the farmhouse. He slowed his horse, watching, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. 2 days later at church, his wife Martha mentioned it to another woman. She's moving things into the root cellar, apparently, cooking things, pots and such. The other woman, Margaret Olson, the township school teacher, looked confused. Into the root cellar? For storage, you mean? No, Martha said slowly. For cooking, I think.
Like she's setting up a kitchen down there.
The women exchanged glances, the kind of glances that said more than words. One of them, Elizabeth Kowalski, spoke carefully. I suppose, well, she's been alone since Henry passed. Maybe she's... Maybe grief affects people in strange ways. Strange. That word made the rounds. Ingrid Hendrickson's doing something strange. She's cooking underground now, like a prairie dog. That's what people said. Like a prairie dog living in a hole. Nobody confronted her directly at first. That wasn't the way of frontier communities. You didn't walk up to someone and tell them they were being foolish. You expressed concern. You offered advice framed as neighborly care. You warned them about the dangers of their choices. John Brenneman stopped by the farm in late June. He tipped his hat politely, asked how the crops were coming in, made small talk about the weather. Then, carefully, he said, "Heard you've been doing some building work, Mrs. Hendrickson."
Expanding the old root cellar, is that right?
Ingrid wiped her hands on her apron. "That's right, extended it northward, made it large enough for cooking and food preparation." John nodded slowly, choosing his words. Cooking underground. That's an unusual approach. "It's practical," Ingrid said. "Temperature stays stable down there, won't freeze in winter like the farmhouse kitchen does." John rubbed his jaw. "I appreciate the thinking, but I'll tell you straight, ground that deep holds moisture. Dampness will get everything. I've seen it happen to folks who tried underground storage wrong. Mold on the food, mildew on everything, and dampness in the air, that'll take your lungs, give you consumption faster than the cold will." "I've accounted for ventilation," Ingrid said. "Fresh air comes in through the entrance, hot air vents through a clay pipe to the surface. The space stays dry." "Maybe so," John said, not sounding convinced. "But winter's a hard test for that kind of setup. Moisture moves in ways you don't expect when the ground freezes. And fire underground, well, that's risky too. Smoke has to have somewhere to go. If that chimney blocks with ice or snow, you'll smoke yourself out. Or worse." "I appreciate the warning," Ingrid said evenly. "I'll be careful." John tipped his hat again and rode on, but Ingrid saw the doubt in his face. He thought she was making a mistake, thought she was in over her head, thought her strange solution would fail when real winter arrived. Pastor Wilhelm came next, a week later. He arrived unannounced, which was his way, riding up to the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon. He was an older man, German-born, with the kind of moral certainty that came from decades of preaching to homesteaders. He sat in her parlor and accepted a cup of coffee, but didn't drink it. "Mrs. Hendrickson," he said carefully, "I've heard some things from members of the congregation. Concerns about your living arrangements."
Ingrid kept her face neutral.
"What concerns?" "Several folks have mentioned that you've moved your kitchen underground, that you're cooking in the root cellar now, that the children are spending time in that space." "They help me carry supplies," Ingrid said. "They don't spend significant time down there." Pastor Wilhelm set his coffee cup down. "A proper kitchen is above ground, Mrs. Hendrickson. That's how the Lord intended it. A home should have light and air. Children should be raised in proper conditions." "The space has both," Ingrid said. "Oil lamps for light, ventilation for air." "It's not natural," the pastor said, more firmly now. "And some in the congregation are worried about the example it sets. A Christian woman, a widow with children, living in a manner that seems, it seems strange, peculiar." There was the word again, peculiar. "I'm not asking anyone else to live this way," Ingrid said quietly. "I'm solving a problem with my own resources, on my own land." Pastor Wilhelm stood. He was a tall man, and he used his height now, looking down at her with what he probably thought was fatherly concern but came across as condescension. "If you need help, Mrs. Hendrickson, the church can provide it. You don't need to resort to this kind of living. We can help you come to your senses." Ingrid stood as well. "Thank you for the offer, Pastor. I'll keep it in mind." He left unsatisfied, and Ingrid knew the message would go back to the congregation. She's not listening. She's determined to continue with this strange behavior. Poor woman has lost her way. At the general store the following week, Martha Brenneman saw Ingrid selecting supplies and spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "I heard you've got your stove in the ground now, Mrs. Hendrickson. How do you even breathe down there? Don't you miss the sunlight?" Other women in the store glanced over. Ingrid felt their eyes, their judgment. She kept her voice level. "The ventilation works well, Mrs. Brenneman, and I spend plenty of time above ground during the day." "But cooking in darkness," Martha continued, shaking her head, "that just seems so unnatural. How do you even see what you're preparing?" "Oil lamps," Ingrid said, "same as anyone uses in a kitchen at night." Martha exchanged a look with another woman, a look that said, "Can you believe this?" She turned back to Ingrid. "Well, I suppose everyone has their own way of doing things, even if those ways seem strange to the rest of us." Ingrid paid for her flour and coffee and left without responding. What was there to say? They'd made up their minds. She was peculiar. She was strange. She was doing something wrong. James Kowalski stopped her outside the church one Sunday in August. He was an older farmer, respected in the community, someone who'd survived 30 years of Dakota farming and knew the land as well as anyone. He spoke with genuine concern, not mockery. "Mrs. Hendrickson," he said, pulling her aside, "I wanted to talk to you about this underground kitchen situation. I've been farming this land 3 decades. I've seen a lot of clever ideas. Some worked, many didn't. Underground spaces are for storage, not for living in. The dampness will ruin your lungs, same as it ruins the food. I've seen good people try ideas that seemed smart and turned bad." Ingrid appreciated that he spoke to her directly, not about her to others. "What specifically concerns you, Mr. Kowalski?" "The moisture," he said. "Underground, you're below the frost line. That's good for temperature, yes, but moisture accumulates. You'll wake up one morning and find mold on everything. Your preserved food will spoil from dampness instead of freezing, and breathing that air day after day, it'll give you lung sickness." "I've built-in drainage," Ingrid said, "and ventilation. The air moves. Fresh air comes in, stale air goes out." "Maybe," James said, "but winter will test it. When the ground freezes solid and the snow piles up, that ventilation might not work like you think. And fire underground is dangerous too, Mrs. Hendrickson. If something goes wrong, if that chimney blocks, if smoke fills the space, you've got nowhere to go except up those stairs. That's a risk." It was the most reasonable warning she'd received, and it made her doubt briefly. What if he was right? What if winter revealed problems she hadn't anticipated? But she thought about the previous winter, about the shattered jars and frozen potatoes, about watching her children go hungry, and she strengthened her resolve. "I appreciate your concern," she said. "I truly do. But I've thought through the design carefully. I'll monitor it closely, and if problems develop, I'll adapt." James nodded slowly. "Your choice, Mrs. Hendrickson. Just wanted to make sure you'd considered the risks." The children heard things too. Helga came home from a neighbor's farm one afternoon in late August, where she'd been helping with the harvest. She found Ingrid in the underground kitchen, arranging jars on the shelves, preparing space for the fall canning. "Mama," Helga said quietly, "Mrs. Brenneman said we're living like animals now. She said people don't cook in holes in the ground. Only animals live underground." Ingrid set down the jar she was holding. "What did you say to her?" "Nothing," Helga said. "I didn't know what to say." Ingrid knelt down to her daughter's level. "We do what works, not what looks normal. Do you understand that? Sometimes the smartest solution looks strange to people who haven't thought it through." But what if they're right? Helga asked. What if this doesn't work in winter? Then we'll adapt, Ingrid said. But I've built this carefully. I've thought through every problem I can imagine, and I believe it will work. Helga nodded, but her face showed uncertainty. The twin boys, Thomas and William, faced teasing at school. They reported it matter-of-factly one evening, the way children do when they don't fully understand the cruelty behind the words. Billy Brenneman says, "We sleep in the dirt now," Thomas said. He asked if we eat worms like moles. We don't sleep underground, Ingrid corrected. We cook there. We live in the farmhouse, like always. But why do we cook in the ground? William asked. Why not cook in the house, like other families? Because the food freezes in the house, Ingrid said. You remember last winter. You remember eating bread and beans for weeks because everything else was ruined. This way, the food won't freeze. The boys accepted this, but Ingrid saw the confusion in their faces. They were too young to understand thermal mass and temperature stability. They just knew their family was different, and different meant people talked. The truth was, Ingrid didn't care much what people thought. She'd stopped caring about that when her husband died, and she realized survival didn't leave room for pride. But the constant undercurrent of judgment, the polite concern that was really criticism, the questions that were really doubts, it wore on her. Every trip to town meant navigating careful conversations. Every church gathering meant feeling the eyes, hearing the whispers that stopped when she approached. By the time September ended and October brought the first frost, Ingrid had stopped explaining her decisions to anyone. She went to town when she needed supplies, spoke politely to neighbors when they crossed paths, and otherwise kept to herself. Let them think what they wanted. Winter would prove the kitchen's worth. Winter would speak for itself. November 2nd, 1889. The cold arrived. Not gradually this time, not the slow descent into winter that Dakota homesteaders usually experienced. This was different. A mass of Arctic air pushed down from Canada, a wall of cold that dropped temperatures 50 degrees in 48 hours. On November 1st, the afternoon temperature reached 35 degrees. By the morning of November 3rd, it was 15 below zero, and it stayed there. 15 below, 20 below, 25 below. For 3 weeks, the temperature never climbed above zero. The wind howled across the plains, driving the wind chill to 40, 50, 60 below zero. Snow fell in dry, fine crystals, accumulating in drifts that buried fence lines and reached halfway up barn walls. This was the kind of cold that killed. Not metaphorically, literally. The kind of cold that froze water solid in covered buckets within an hour. The kind of cold that made exposed skin go numb in under a minute. The kind of cold that turned above-ground kitchens into ice boxes, regardless of how hard you burned the stove. Across the township, families hunkered down and fought for survival. John Brenneman's family huddled in their farmhouse with every blanket they owned piled on the children. John fed the stove constantly, splitting wood, hauling it inside, burning it as fast as he could keep the fire going. The kitchen stayed barely warm enough to prevent frostbite, maybe 30 degrees inside at best. The windows frosted over so thick you couldn't see through them. Ice formed on the interior walls where breath condensed and froze. Martha tried keeping their preserved food near the stove, thinking the heat would protect it. Some jars survived. Most didn't. The temperature fluctuations were brutal. Near the stove, maybe 40 degrees. 10 feet away, below freezing. The jars that sat in the pantry froze solid within days. Martha woke one morning to the sound of cracking glass, a sharp pop like a gunshot. She ran to the pantry and found 3 jars of tomatoes burst open, the contents frozen into red ice, glass shards scattered across the shelf. By the second week, they'd lost 20 jars. By the third week, 35. Each one represented hours of summer work. Each one was food they'd need to survive until spring. The potatoes in their storage bins froze despite Martha's efforts to insulate them. She piled blankets over the bins, thinking that would help. It didn't. The cold was too penetrating, too absolute. Within 10 days, the potatoes were solid blocks of ice. When the temperature moderated slightly, they thawed into a black, rotten mess. John looked at their remaining food supply with growing dread. They'd started winter with enough to last until April. Now, 3 weeks into November, they'd lost 40%. If the cold continued through March, they'd run out of food by February. The Kowalski family had it worse. 6 children meant more mouths to feed, more bodies to keep warm. James burned through his wood supply at an alarming rate. His wife, Anna, tried everything to protect their food. She kept jars wrapped in cloth near the stove. She buried potatoes under straw in the pantry. She moved their smoked meat to the coldest corner, thinking steady cold was better than temperature swings. Nothing worked. The jars near the stove cracked from the temperature changes. The potatoes under the straw froze anyway. The smoked meat developed ice crystals, then moisture problems, then signs of spoilage. By week 2, Anna was rationing, smaller portions at meals, bread and dried beans for supper instead of preserved vegetables. The children complained they were hungry. James and Anna went to bed with their own stomachs empty, giving the food to the children first. James stood in his pantry one evening, looking at the dwindling supplies, doing the math. 3 months until spring planting, maybe 4 if the cold lasted. At current rations, they had 6 weeks of food left. He'd have to ask the church for help. The thought made him sick with shame, but hunger was stronger than pride.
Widow Hanson, the elderly woman who lived alone 3 miles south, faced the worst situation. She had no family nearby, no strong back to haul endless wood, no reserve supplies. Her small farmhouse leaked heat like a sieve. She burned what wood she had, then started burning furniture. A chair, then another, then the small table from her bedroom. Her preserved food froze and ruined within the first week. Everything. Jars cracking, potatoes turning to ice, the carrots and turnips she'd stored in bins becoming inedible frozen blocks. By week 2, she was living on dried cornmeal and salt pork, 1 thin meal a day, rationing every bite. Pastor Wilhelm found her in week 3, checking on parishioners as the cold continued. She was wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, sitting next to a dying fire, too weak to haul more wood from the shed. He carried her to the church, where the congregation took turns caring for her, sharing what food they could spare. But everyone was struggling. Everyone's supplies were running short. Across the township, the pattern was the same: families burning through wood faster than anticipated, food supplies freezing and spoiling, children going hungry, adults rationing. The cold was a physical enemy, something you could fight but never fully defeat. You could only survive it, hour by hour, day by day, log by log, hoping your supplies lasted longer than the cold. But in Ingrid Hendrickson's underground kitchen, something different was happening, or rather, almost nothing was happening. The temperature held steady, 48 degrees on November 5th, 51 degrees on November 10th, 49 degrees on November 15th. Never freezing, never fluctuating more than a few degrees. The earth surrounding the chamber, thousands of pounds of stone and soil, absorbed the small amount of heat from Ingrid's cooking fires and held it through the long, cold nights. She descended the stairs each morning to find a comfortable workspace, not warm like summer, not blazing hot, but genuinely, noticeably warm compared to the brutal cold above ground. She'd cook breakfast on the stove, just an hour of fire, enough to boil water for porridge and heat the space to 52 degrees. Then she'd let the fire die down, and the thermal mass would hold that temperature for hours. By evening, when she came down to prepare supper, the temperature had dropped to maybe 48 degrees. She'd build another small fire, cook the meal, and the cycle would repeat. 2 hours of actual fire per day, maybe 3 on the coldest days. Nowhere near the constant burning her neighbors were doing. The preserved food sat untouched by frost. The jars of tomatoes remained perfect, no cracking, no freezing, the contents exactly as she'd canned them in August. The beans, the applesauce, the pickles, all perfect. She walked along the shelves one morning, touching each jar, checking for any signs of freezing or spoilage. Nothing. Everything stable. The potatoes in their bins felt firm and fresh. No freeze damage, no rot. She picked one up, examined it, and saw a potato that looked like it had been harvested yesterday instead of 3 months ago. The carrots and turnips were the same. The underground temperature, steady at 48 to 52 degrees, was perfect for root vegetable storage. Cool enough to prevent sprouting, warm enough to prevent freezing. She stood in the center of her underground kitchen one evening in mid-November and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Above ground, the temperature was 30 below zero. The wind was howling across the plains at 40 miles per hour. Her neighbors were burning through their wood supplies, watching their food freeze and crack, rationing every meal. Down here, 8 feet below the frozen surface, surrounded by stone and earth, she was comfortable. The children were fed, the food was safe, and she'd used maybe 1/4 of the firewood her neighbors had burned. Nobody from the township checked on her. They assumed she was struggling even worse than they were. How could someone cooking in a hole in the ground possibly be surviving? Poor woman probably can't even keep a fire going down there, Martha Brenneman said to her husband. I wonder if we should take her some food when this breaks. John shook his head. She's too proud to accept it. She made her choice. She'll have to live with it. They had no idea. None of them did. They were suffering above ground while Ingrid thrived below it, and the irony was sharp enough to cut. Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything they thought about food preservation. The cold broke on November 24th. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. The temperature climbed from 25 below to 15 below, then to 5 below. Then, on November 26th, to 10 above zero. It felt like a heat wave. Families emerged from their farmhouses, exhausted, depleted, grateful to have survived. And that's when Martha Brenneman came to the Hendrickson farm. She came not to visit, but to deliver charity. The church had organized a relief effort, gathering what supplies people could spare, distributing them to families who'd suffered the worst losses. And everyone assumed Ingrid Hendrickson, cooking in her underground hole, must be among the worst off. Martha brought a basket of dried beans and salt pork, food she could barely spare from her own depleted stores, but the Christian thing to do was help your neighbors. She knocked on the farmhouse door, expecting to find a desperate, hungry family. Ingrid answered, looking tired but healthy, not gaunt, not desperate, just a woman who'd been working hard. Mrs. Brenneman, Ingrid said, surprised. Is everything all right? Martha held up the basket. I wanted to, well, the church put together some supplies for families who lost food to the cold. I thought that you could use some help getting through until spring. Ingrid looked at the basket, then at Martha's face, and understood. They thought she was starving. They thought her strange underground kitchen had failed and left her with nothing. That's very kind of you, Ingrid said carefully. But we're managing well. Our supplies are intact. Martha's expression shifted to confusion. Intact? But in this cold, surely everything froze. We lost more than half our preserves. The Kowalskis lost nearly everything. Even with stoves burning constantly, the food just froze. Mine didn't freeze, Ingrid said. Would you like to come in? I was just about to make tea. I have some preserved peaches I could open.
Martha stared at her. Preserved peaches? Fresh preserves? From this summer's canning, Ingrid said. They've stayed perfectly preserved in the underground kitchen. She led Martha through the farmhouse and out to the root cellar entrance. Martha followed, confused, carrying her charity basket, trying to understand what was happening. Ingrid opened the exterior door and started down the stairs. Martha hesitated, then descended after her. The temperature change was immediate and startling. Outside, the air was 10 degrees above zero, bitter and biting. The stairs were cold, frost clinging to the wooden steps. But as they descended, as they moved below the frost line, the air warmed. By the time they reached the bottom door, Martha could feel the difference. Ingrid opened the interior door, and warm air washed over them. Not blazing hot, not stuffy or uncomfortable, but genuinely, noticeably warm. Martha stepped into the underground kitchen and stopped, staring. The space was lit by 3 oil lamps, their flames steady and bright. The stone walls glowed in the lamplight. Shelves lined the walls, packed with jars of preserved food. Bins of vegetables sat along one side. A work table occupied the center of the room. In the corner, the cast iron stove radiated gentle heat. "It's warm down here," Martha said, pulling off her shawl. She touched her face, feeling it start to thaw. How is this possible? The earth holds the temperature steady, Ingrid explained. 8 feet down, surrounded by stone and soil, the space never freezes. The small cooking fires add a bit of warmth, and the thermal mass holds it for hours. Martha walked slowly around the room, touching things. She ran her hand along a shelf of canning jars, tomatoes, beans, applesauce, pickles, all perfect, glass intact, contents unfrozen. She looked at Ingrid. None of these cracked? Not one? Not one, Ingrid confirmed. Martha walked to the vegetable bins. She picked up a potato, examined it, squeezed it gently. It was firm, fresh, no freeze damage. She put it down and picked up a carrot. Same condition. Perfect. "We lost all our potatoes," Martha said quietly. Froze solid. Turned to mush when they thawed. She looked around the underground kitchen again, seeing the shelves of preserved food, the bins of fresh vegetables, the comfortable temperature. "You've been cooking down here through the whole cold snap?" "Every day," Ingrid said. "Breakfast and supper. The stove burns for maybe 2 hours total. The rest of the time, the earth holds the warmth." Martha walked to the thermometer hanging on the wall. She stared at it. 51 degrees, she read aloud. "We can't keep our kitchen above 30 degrees even with the stove burning all day." She turned to Ingrid. "How much wood have you used?" "Maybe a quarter of what you've probably burned," Ingrid said. "The thermal mass does most of the work." Martha sat down on the bench near the work table. She set her charity basket on the floor. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, quietly, she said, "We mocked you." "You did," Ingrid agreed. "We told you this wouldn't work. We said you were being strange, peculiar. We said you'd lost your mind. You said a lot of things." Martha looked up at her. "We were wrong." Ingrid didn't respond. What was there to say? The evidence was all around them. Perfect food preservation, comfortable temperature, minimal fuel use. Everything Martha's family had lost, Ingrid had kept. Everything Martha had struggled with, Ingrid had solved. "Can I bring John to see this?" Martha asked finally. "He needs to. He should understand what you've built here." "Bring whoever you'd like," Ingrid said. Martha stood, picked up her charity basket, and started up the stairs. Halfway up, she paused and looked back. "Mrs. Hendrickson," she said, "I'm sorry for what we said, for how we judged you." Ingrid nodded once, accepted. The next day, John Brenneman came with Martha. He examined everything with a farmer's practical eye. The stone walls, built with a slight inward lean for stability. The ventilation pipe, drawing fresh air naturally through temperature differences. The drainage system, sloped floor leading to a gravel-filled sump. The timber ceiling, supporting tons of earth above. He touched the stone walls and felt them, slightly warm from stored heat. He checked the thermometer, saw 49 degrees, compared it mentally to the 25-degree temperature in his own kitchen that morning. He walked along the shelves of perfect preserves, picking up jars, examining them, setting them down carefully. Finally, he turned to Ingrid. "This is engineering," he said. "This is smart, not strange. Smart." "Thank you," Ingrid said simply. "The ventilation system," John said, pointing to the clay pipe. "That's what keeps the air fresh?" "That and the double-door entrance," Ingrid explained, "creates an airlock effect. Fresh air comes in through the stairs, warm air vents out through the pipe. Natural convection." "And you're burning how much wood?" John asked. 2, maybe 3 hours of fire per day, Ingrid said, "for cooking. The thermal mass holds the heat overnight." John looked at her with something approaching awe. "We've been burning wood 20 hours a day trying to keep our kitchen warm enough to work in, and we still lost half our food to freezing." "I know," Ingrid said quietly. He walked to the vegetable bins, picked up a potato, examined it. "Our potatoes turned to black slush," he said. "Yours look like they were harvested yesterday." "Temperature stability," Ingrid said. "No freezing, no thawing, no temperature swings, just steady, cool storage." John set the potato down. "Mrs. Hendrickson," he said, "would you mind if I copied this design? I'd like to build something similar. Not exactly the same, but the principle. Underground space, stone walls, proper ventilation." "Copy whatever you like," Ingrid said. "It's not a secret." Word spread quickly. Martha told the women at the next church gathering. She didn't exaggerate, didn't embellish, just stated the facts. "I was there. I saw it. 60 jars of perfect preserves, fresh vegetables, everything we've lost to freezing she's kept, and she's using a quarter of the wood we are." The initial reaction was skepticism. "Underground kitchen still sounds strange," one woman said. "I thought so too," Martha replied, "until I stood in it, until I felt how warm it was, until I saw the food. Strange or not, it works." That shifted the conversation, from mockery to curiosity, from judgment to interest. How did she build it? What materials did she use? Could it work for other families? Margaret Olson, the schoolteacher, visited 3 days later. She brought a notebook and pencil and spent 2 hours in the underground kitchen, taking measurements, sketching diagrams, asking questions about drainage, ventilation, thermal mass, structural support. She'd been planning to build a new farmhouse in the spring. Now she was reconsidering the design. "If I could incorporate an underground level," she said, thinking out loud, "kitchen and food storage below, living space above. The heat from the kitchen would rise into the living area. The earth would insulate both." "It would work," Ingrid said. James Kowalski came next, bringing his eldest son. They examined the construction carefully, the dry stacked stone walls, the timber framing, the ventilation system. James was particularly interested in the thermal mass principle, how the stone absorbed and released heat over hours. "I've got a root cellar," he said. 8 feet deep, stone walls. If I extended it, added a proper stove and chimney, built in better ventilation." He looked at Ingrid. "Would you mind if I used your design?" "It's not mine to keep from you," Ingrid said. "Use whatever helps your family." Even Pastor Wilhelm came, brought by Martha Brenneman. He descended the stairs, felt the warmth, saw the preserved food, and stood in silence for a long moment. Then he turned to Ingrid and said, "I spoke rashly when I called this unnatural. I see now that I was wrong. Forgive my presumption." Ingrid inclined her head. Forgiven. By spring, 3 families in the township had started building similar structures. James Kowalski extended his root cellar, adding 10 feet of length, installing a small stove and proper ventilation. He used Ingrid's design but modified it, adding wooden shelving instead of stone alcoves, using concrete for the floor instead of packed earth. The Olson family built a new farmhouse with an underground kitchen as the foundation. Margaret's design incorporated windows set in light wells, vertical shafts that brought natural light down into the underground space. The kitchen stayed warm in winter, cool in summer, and she reported using 60% less firewood than her old farmhouse required. A young couple, the Hansons, built a completely underground kitchen with an earthen roof, separate from their farmhouse. They covered the roof with 3 feet of sod, planted prairie grass on top, creating a space that was nearly invisible from a distance. Their food never froze. Their fuel costs dropped dramatically. Each family adapted the principle to their situation. Some built large, some built small. Some used stone, some used concrete when it became available in the early 1890s. Some added innovations, hand pumps to bring water underground, metal ventilation pipes instead of clay, windows and skylights in various configurations. But the core principle remained the same. Go underground. Use the Earth's stable temperature. Minimize heat loss through thermal mass. Let natural systems do the work. Ingrid's demonstration had proven the concept. Now others refined and spread it. By 1895, an estimated 25 farms within 50 miles were using underground kitchens or hybrid storage systems. Local builders began specializing in underground construction. A carpenter from Cooperstown started advertising Dakota Root Kitchen Installation, offering to excavate, build, and install complete systems. The Cooperative Extension Service, established in the early 1900s to share agricultural knowledge, published a bulletin titled Cold Climate Underground Food Preservation. The publication included diagrams, materials lists, and construction guidelines based on interviews with farmers across North Dakota. Ingrid's name appeared in the bulletin as one of the early adopters who demonstrated the technique's effectiveness. Farming journals picked up the story. The Dakota Farmer ran an article in 1902 about earth-sheltered food storage, describing it as an old technique rediscovered by practical homesteaders facing extreme conditions. The article mentioned several farms by name, including Ingrid's, and provided basic construction details. The technique became known in some circles as North Dakota-style root kitchen, a hybrid between traditional root cellars and full kitchens, designed specifically for extreme cold climates where above-ground food storage failed regularly. Ingrid herself continued farming until 1905, when she sold the property and moved to Cooperstown to be closer to Helga, who'd married and started a family. The new owners, a young couple from Iowa, specifically wanted the property because of the underground kitchen. They kept using it every winter for the next 20 years, adding their own modifications, maintaining the stone walls and ventilation system that Ingrid had built. Helga built a similar system when she and her husband established their own farm in 1898. Smaller than her mother's, just a storage room rather than a full kitchen, but using the same principles. The twin boys, Thomas and William, both remembered the underground kitchen when they grew up. Thomas mentioned it in a letter to his wife's family in 1910, describing it as the smartest thing my mother ever built, saved us from starving more than once. Ingrid never claimed to have invented anything revolutionary. When people asked her about the design in later years, she'd shrug and say, "I just solved a problem with what I had." She didn't write articles about it, didn't lecture, didn't seek recognition. She'd built what she needed, shared the knowledge freely, and moved on with her life. But the lessons spread anyway, quietly, practically, family to family, builder to builder, farmer to farmer. By the time Ingrid died in 1923 at the age of 72, the technique she'd demonstrated had become an accepted part of regional building tradition in cold climate homesteading. Ingrid Hendrickson didn't invent underground food preservation. Humans have been using earth-sheltered storage for thousands of years, from ancient pit houses to medieval root cellars to modern earth-insulated pantries. What she did was adapt that ancient wisdom to her specific problem, using materials at hand, solving a challenge that was starving families.
And in doing that, she reminded a whole township of Dakota homesteaders that sometimes the old ways, the ways that seemed primitive or strange, were actually the ways that worked best when survival depended on it. The earth is a battery. It stores temperature. It moderates extremes. It protects against the elements. All you have to do is use it. That was Ingrid's contribution, not a grand invention, but a practical demonstration, a proof that when you stop worrying about what looks proper and start focusing on what works, you can preserve food that would otherwise be lost. The underground kitchen beneath that North Dakota farm wasn't just a storage space. It was a lesson. And like all good lessons, it spread quietly, winter by winter, until it became part of how people thought about survival. Where are you watching from? And what's the biggest challenge you've faced preserving food through winter? Drop a comment below. I read everyone, and your stories matter. If this kind of practical frontier wisdom speaks to you, hit subscribe. Every week, I bring you one more technique that worked when survival depended on it. Real history, real engineering, real solutions. Thanks for watching. Stay warm and keep your food fresh out there. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.